Hey all you whiskey fans, thanks for stopping by. Today, let's talk a little bit about Canadian whiskey. Now we've talked about Canadian whiskey before, specifically Macaloni's. This was very interesting to me because based on what I know about whiskey, Canadian whiskey, this is a very, very different product. So instead of talking about Canadian whiskey heavily influenced by Scotland, let's take a little bit of a twist and talk about more traditional Canadian whiskey. If you've watched my videos in the past, you know that I love Dr. Don Livermore. And I love things that he's done in the whiskey community. He's written many very interesting and exciting books. And of course his flavor wheel, which I made a video about, it's up here if you want to watch it, is one of my favorites. It's a must check out wheel. But that's not where the topic is today. Today, I want to talk a little bit about what other things Canadian whiskey does and some things that the country has allowed them to do that makes them so different than other whiskey producers around the world. If you're like me and somebody who doesn't necessarily drink a lot of Canadian whiskey, you might be surprised to learn that Canada actually produces over 21 million cases of whiskey a year. Each case is roughly 9 liters. The US does 37, and Scotland does like a whopping 78. But Canada is in the mix. It's not a small producer. Now, as I mentioned before, they're very different in many ways. And part of the way that they're different is that the country itself, Canada, is very flexible on the terminology and the terms that they get to use when they're describing or designating a spirit as whiskey. As we've talked about on this channel before, where you are in the world, where you are sitting and consuming whiskey, actually plays a bigger role than the country that the whiskey comes from. The US, for instance, very strict regulations on what is a bourbon, but relatively relaxed on what is whiskey. Switzerland, where we are now, kind of follows European rules, and it's super interesting. Now, what's interesting about Canadian whiskey is, I just use this whiskey as an example. So this is the Lot 40 Rye Whiskey, 100% rye. And there's some things on this bottle which kind of, well, if I didn't know this was Canadian, would give me a very different idea of what this whiskey would taste like in my head. These things being that this is aged in new oak barrels, like American whiskeys, like bourbons. Okay, I know what that tastes like. Copper pot distilled. Okay, that makes me think that, hey, it's like a Irish whiskey, which is single pot still, or like, which is probably 2 or 3 times distilled, but that's okay. Pot stilled, or back here, some Scottish whiskeys. Thinking, okay, usually kind of heavier, oilier, more full body whiskeys. They don't get stripped down so much through a column still or a coffee still. And last but not least, of course, it's a rye. And I know rye very well because I use a lot of it at March Distilling, and I'm a big fan of rye whiskeys. However, it's not necessarily so simple. What's super crazy about this whiskey is, again, because of the different ways that Canada allows flexibility in how whiskeys can be created and allows for a lot of ingenuity from distillers and blenders. As a quick example, although a lot of Canadian distilleries have mash bills, or they might have a whiskey which is, let's say, 90% rye, 5% corn, 5% barley, they don't do this how the Americans do this, by throwing all of this in a big mash tun, cooking it, fermenting it, and then distilling it. Instead, they are cooking each of these different grains individually. So they will take a big old amount of corn, cook that, ferment that, then they'll take a whole bunch of rye, cook that, ferment that, and then they'll take a whole bunch of barley, or whatever other grains they might be using, cook and ferment. You get the idea. Not only do they then do this, but of course distillation stays separate and aging in a barrel is also different. The only time that these different grains get mixed together is when the blender is mixing them for a particular batch of whiskey. Very different than the US. You might be thinking, hey, this doesn't sound possible, right? I mean, you can't ferment, or you can't break all the starches into sugars to ferment corn on its own, unless it's malted, but usually not. And yeah, okay, rye can go, barley can go, but this doesn't sound right. Efficiency would be low. And as we discussed, these Canadian distilleries are making a lot of whiskey. Well, this is also because in Canada, you're allowed to add enzymes to your whiskey, but not the whiskey when it's produced, but to your mash. All these enzymes are helping break down the starches into smaller sugars that the yeast can consume and make alcohol. Some parts of the world, like Scotland, this is illegal. But in Canada and the US, many other countries, it's totally fine to do. When having this whiskey, I've already had a couple glasses of it. What's really interesting is, of course, it's super smooth. How you would imagine Canadian whiskey to be. It's only around 43% ABV, so it doesn't really have a lot of body. This is the entry-level version. There are higher proof versions, but sadly, all I could get in Switzerland at the moment. And it's smooth, right? So again, although it's being aged in new oak barrels, it hits you in the mouth a little bit. Of course, you're getting a lot of that sweetness, those kind of wood oak forward character notes that you would imagine. There's a lot of fruit in here too. Of course, being 100% rye, a lot of dark, like stone fruit. And you, of course, are gonna get that rye spice. Coming back to it, yeah, nose is super rye, dark fruit, a little bit of spice on there, but certainly a lot of sweetness, probably from the oak. Really wish I had a little bit more ABV and a kick in there, but it's a good nose. If you like rye whiskey, you're not going to be disappointed. Palate stays pretty true to the nose. It's very smooth. It's not offensive. It's a good glass of whiskey. A little bit more of that oak tannin burn kind of at the end. New oak makes sense, but it's super smooth. And again, when you compare it to something which is also pot stilled, something doesn't add up. Either they've distilled this like 10 times through a pot still and got it super smooth, or there's something else going on, and that's truth. What are they doing? Very interesting. This whiskey, and by the way, almost every whiskey being produced at Herman Walker is actually going through what they call a beer still, but it's a column still. It's a continuous still. It's one of these long tubular stills, so not like a pot still, but like a tubular still where the mash gets pumped in somewhere near the middle to the top of the still. The heavier components fall down, and then it's of course heated at the bottom, and the steam pushes upwards the alcohol vapors, which then get condensed. But it's a pot stilled whiskey. Yeah. After it's already been distilled through a column still. So it comes off the still already pretty pure at 60 to 70%. Then it's of course watered down. You don't go into a pot still at a high ABV. That's super dangerous. If you're ever home distilling and you're trying to distill something twice, please, please, please water that stuff down. Under 30, it's super dangerous. Do not put or heat up high alcohol. After it's 60, 70% distilled, 60-70% ABV, that is then taken and then it is put into the pot still. What comes off the pot still is then roughly 80%, and then it's into the barrel at 58% ABV. Again, super crazy. Blew my mind when I saw this because I thought if you're a pot still, you're only being made in pots. However, this does make sense because it's very, very tricky and hard, I would say, to take a on-grain, mashed, fermented, and distilled whiskey with all the grains and everything in there and put it into a pot still and direct heat it. Why? Because all those particles in the fermentation will get hot and could scorch. Could give you like burnt flavors, at best burnt popcorn, but nobody wants that in a whiskey. So it makes way more sense to do the Scottish style of distillation where you take the wash or the mash, and then you lauter it. You separate all of the hard grain from the liquid. And you take that distiller's beer, and then you distill that on its own in a pot still. Because then you don't have any hard, big components. There's less to burn, and your whiskey is gonna taste how it should, not burnt. So it makes sense that because they're doing everything on grain, it first needs to go through their beer or column still, and then their pot still. But that's super different than what I'm used to. Herman Walker calls this type of pot still distillation techniques their star special design, which to me is quite special and blew my mind when I learned about it. In fact, it made me need to go pick up a bottle right away and try it because I have never tasted first column distilled and then pot distilled whiskey. Super interesting, worth the glass. If you can find this, I heavily recommend getting the higher ABV releases. You'll just get a lot more out of it. This is a super smooth, easy sipper, I would drink this neat like I am without a problem. I like ryes. I like new oak barrels being used, so this is right up my alley. By the way, as a quick tip, I mentioned earlier that it's really hard to take on-grain fermentations and distill them in a pot still. You've probably heard about these guys if you're on YouTube, but Iron Root Distillery does exactly this. So when they are mashing and fermenting, they keep all the grain particles in there, and then they pump all of this into a pot still. It becomes a very rich, heavy, oily whiskey with a lot of bold flavor and characteristics. That's not this, but if you want to try something more in that line, check out Iron Roots. With that, cheers to you, your next glass of whiskey. Maybe it's Canadian pots distilled. Cheers.